Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Robin. Today we'll be talking about how new mobile research can help you uncover the true consumer preferences in emerging markets. Now that's quite a mouthful, so let's just break it down step by step as we go through this webinar, what we exactly mean with that. First, let's talk a little bit about the relevance basically of emerging markets. And most of our clients are actually well aware emerging markets are really the ones that are going to be driving growth in the coming years. According to McKinsey, about 440 of the emerging market cities are going to be delivering more than half or half of the global GDP growth in the coming years. And it's therefore also no surprise that we see a real shift in the focus of research to these markets. But of course, doing effective market research in some of these emerging markets comes with its own challenges. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. First off, we know that in emerging markets it can be difficult to reach your right target demographics. Lower online penetration makes it hard to reach the right people, and especially for MNCs as well as market research agencies who are used to working in developed markets, we've kind of been spoiled for easily accessible online respondents. In emerging markets, it often meant that we had to rely on more costly offline research to reach that right target demographic. A second challenge of doing research in emerging markets is that sometimes the approaches that have served us well in developed markets tend to be a bit complex and difficult to understand for certain target groups and target demographics, especially when you're looking at lower socioeconomic classes, when you're looking at lower education levels. Then some of the approaches that we typically use could be a bit difficult to understand. And if there's limited guidance by an interviewer, that can lead to problems in the data quality. On the other hand, if you have an interviewer present that guides too much in the interview process, that also leads to its own data quality problems. So it's definitely something to keep in mind. Thirdly, and actually one that I'm very interested in myself, is that cultural norms can make it harder to really get to true underlying preferences. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but for countries with different cultures, respondents may be more or less likely to share their opinions frankly. In some cultures, you rely more on high context communications, whereas others are very direct. For us to do research across emerging markets, across different cultures, and get very accurate results, we really need to make sure that our research solutions also aren't impacted by these cultural differences, and we're able to get to real underlying preferences in a reliable way.
All right, so the big question is, this is Paul, and the big question then is, of course, how do we solve for that issue, right? So, I mean, what we did is we basically looked at a new research innovation that we're developing and really try to tie it back to the needs of the global, or sorry, of the emerging markets, right? So if we see what we developed in the end, what we're looking at is a research solution that first and foremost had to be mobile, because as Robin explained, you know, in some of these markets, online penetration is much lower than in developing markets. So we knew that if we want to reach the people, we got to go mobile. Second, we knew that the service complexity might be an issue. So what we had to do there is make sure that we have a very simple, intuitive, and also fun solution that people can easily do and don't get stressed out by or confused by. And the third criteria that we basically set out to meet was that you know, in order to reduce some of these biases, get to truer preferences, we know that we have to reduce the rationality of the exercises, because biases are created from people overthinking about things and consciously changing their answers to adhere to some cultural expectations or norms, trying to be nice, etc. So, you know, if we want to avoid that, we really have to measure at a more subconscious level. So basically, there's no chance for people to have these rational processes that create some of those biases kick in. So what we ended up with was a research solution that consisted of three modules. And quite frankly, we also use this, of course, in developing countries where these methods are also very relevant, but they have particular, you know, use in these emerging markets where we face these three problems. And the solution consists of three modules. There's a swiping module, a trade-off module, and a heat map or basically a feedback module. And in the first module, let's actually not talk too much about the details of these modules at this point, because we're going to do that in a little bit. But let me first say that, in this particular case, we call module 1 attraction, module 2 conversion, and module 3 the why. And that is because the case study that we're going to present a little later on Asia, where we tested some of these hypotheses, does it drive engagement, and does it really reduce response biases, are done in the context of a communication study. And in communication, if we're talking product messaging or if we're talking advertising, the concept of attraction and conversion is very important, and that's why, to explain the concept in a little bit, we stick with that format. But in reality, we can use these modules, whether it's swiping or trade-offs, for all kinds of applications way beyond this particular case. Before we explain it, let's look at a little video first, and after we've done that, then we go into more detail. Okay, so I hope that gave you a little bit of an impression of what the approach looked like. But basically, we quickly showed a preview of all the 3 modules. We're not going to talk about the 3rd module because, that is the least innovative. I mean, it's fun, it's intuitive. People click on something, the part they like, and you get a pop-up, and you type what you think about it. But the real interesting part is the first 2 modules where we're actually measuring quantitatively how certain stimuli perform. And then the first module, the attraction module, basically how it works is that people repeatedly swipe stimuli to the right if they like it and to the left if they don't. In this case, you see an example of a Corona ad. So for example, we could be testing different variations of Corona advertisements and try to find the one that really works best in market. It's important then, of course, that we not just have people swipe Corona ads, but that we mix it in with a lot of competitive ads to really, mimic the clutter of the real market, right? Because, that's really where Corona in the end will have to perform, and not just in an isolated environment where only Corona exists. So what happens in this exercise, people make really quick and intuitive judgment right after each other. And what that means at a more technical or psychological level, you could say, is that judgment that made are in isolation like this, right? Just one swipe to the left or to the right, tend to be more emotional, automatic, and associative. To use a popular term, of course, in research, basically that means it draws more onto the system 1 processes, the subconscious processes that are happening in the brain. And while the exercise is very simple and intuitive, so easy to conduct, actually in the back end it's quite complicated how we model it. And the inputs that we use for modeling are, of course, the direction of the swipe and the reaction time. We don't go into too much detail on how that is done specifically, but of course, if you're interested in that, we're more happy to share a lot more details about that later. But the end result is basically based on these 2 metrics, a score from 0 to 100, where 100 means maximum performance, everybody likes it, and swipes really fast, is really convinced, and 0, of course, means the opposite. If we then look at the second module, actually, before we continue, just to add one thing to the previous module is that when people react intuitively and quickly, that's very good for basically measuring initial reactions to stimuli, right? And that is, if you want to see what breaks through the clutter, you want people's initial first gut response, and then they walk to the shelf, or they click on the banner and things like that. However, at one point you have driven them to the shelf, you've attracted them, and then a whole different game starts. You know, when you have brought the consumer to the shelf, or now it is in a shopping portal where you can actually convert them from shoppers into buyers of your brand, people start making choices. And when people start making choices between products or options, automatically what happens is that more rational processes kick in. And so if we want to measure in the end what is really driving conversion at the shelf in the supermarket or in a certain website where people make choices between products, we also have to model that in that way. So the conversion model is an exercise where people make choices between options, and these joint judgments tend to be more rational in nature, and which is exactly what we want, because it represents the process the human brain goes through when you're actually faced with decisions at the point of sale. Again, we use two inputs to model this. So maybe I should explain first what they actually see. So in this case, you see two different laundry detergents, and people just quickly get two options. They click on the one they prefer, and then we of course change the stimuli. You know, like in this case, we would be changing messages that belong to the product, but we could also change the ads belonging to it. We could even change the packaging. You know, we could change anything, and then they repeatedly choose between two options quickly in an intuitive way, and then we model it based on the choice that they make and how long it takes for them to make the decision. And the reaction time is of course a measure of conviction, because if you're not sure if two things are almost equal to you, then it will take a bit longer for you to decide. If you're very clear on your preference between two, you click quickly because it's an easy decision to make. So both of those factor into our modeling, and then we create a sort of a market simulator model out of it, which helps you determine, you know, what ad or what message or what other product characteristics help you maximize the share of your brand versus competition, and in other words, maximize conversion. So that is really, you know, like a background on the method that we use. Now the really interesting part, some of you might have seen this already before, now the really interesting part is like, how does it really help in these emerging markets? Did it really help in, you know, solving some of the problems that we have outlined at the beginning? And Robin, who is very experienced in Asia, will talk us through the results of the research that we did there.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. So as we discussed a little bit earlier, there's three main challenges that we see in doing research in emerging markets. And Paul already alluded a little bit to how these new approaches can help us tackle some of these problems. To go in a little bit more depth, what we'd like to share with you is a case study on Asian markets specifically. For us here in Asia, our team was immediately very much interested in the possibilities of these new research approaches to tackling these problems in the region. So just as a refresher, the three challenges we saw are how to reach the right people, engaging and connecting in a way that is easy to understand, and the third, understanding underlying preferences in any cultural setting, basically. So to go to the first challenge quickly, I think this is kind of a no-brainer for many of you who have experience in markets in Asia and are seeing the developments in the markets here. Mobile technology really is very relevant for Asia, and actually for all emerging markets across the world. As in a lot of emerging markets, mobile internet access is leapfrogging that of wired access. For a lot of people, especially the youth growing up now, mobile is the first touch point with the internet. It's the first access that they have to the internet and the world around them. So that makes mobile the ideal mode for conducting research, as it helps us to reach more people that we wouldn't otherwise be able to reach with traditional computer-based research. However, this also stresses the importance for us to adapt our traditional approaches into ways that are designed with mobile in mind. The second challenge, as we just talked about, is basically the complexity, or on the other hand, the simplicity of solutions and the research that we do. As you just saw from the examples that Paul provided, we've developed the approach here to be as intuitive as possible, and we also wanted to confirm whether this is something that would be easier to understand for people in emerging markets, basically. We know that traditional methods are not very engaging in nature. They're We see already in developed markets that people shortening attention spans are resulting in data quality dropping in recent years, and as we just mentioned already, in some of the developing markets, emerging markets, asking questions in an overly complicated way can lead to data quality issues as well. Now, what we've seen, luckily, is that in the tests that we've done so far, we see very high engagement in these studies, in these studies where we applied this new approach. We see also from open-ended input that respondents see that it's intuitive, that it's fun, it's entertaining to use, and therefore they also have very high engagement. So the easier we keep the method, the higher engagement is, and also the higher our data quality that we can get. Now, the third challenge, and as I indicated a little bit earlier, one that I find very interesting myself as well, is understanding true underlying preferences, basically in any cultural setting. We link this to response biases. As Paul mentioned already, these new approaches rely more on subconscious processes of the brain. And especially with the team here in Asia, we felt that these approaches could really help us to deal with some of the response biases that we see are very common in Asia and in other emerging markets. The first being acquiescent response style, which basically means a tendency of a respondent to agree with any question that the interviewer asks. And the second being socially desirable responses. Basically a tendency to want to present yourself in a better light, or to want to answer something in a way that you think will make you look better to the eyes of the interviewer. So what we did to test these hypotheses, or whether this new and more intuitive way of doing research could really help us overcome these biases, is we've set up a study to test these hypotheses. And what we did is we created 10 shampoo messages designed to range very much in their different benefits that they talk about to kind of convince a consumer to buy the product. And we tested these 10 shampoo messages through 3 different methodologies. One being a traditional rating question, one being a max diff approach, and the other being the swiping module of the approach that Paul presented on earlier. We then fielded that study across 4 different markets. Together with one of our research partners, Research Now, we chose for India, Philippines, Singapore, and Australia, all of them in English language, so that we knew at least language would not be a factor that could throw off our results moving forward. So let's have a look at the results. First off, for acquiescent response style. What you see here on screen is the average scores for all the 10 messages that we tested using the traditional rating question with a 7-point scale. So what you see here is that in India, people are more inclined to answer all the claims or messages positively, and in Australia, overall, all the messages were rated least positively. In the parentheses, you see an index number that will help us to make it a little bit easier to compare. As a next step, let's have a look at the average scores from the swiping exercise, where again, between parentheses, you see the indexed score. And here, when you look at the comparison between India, Philippines, and Singapore, you see that these indexes are much closer together, meaning that we have a better source to compare between these different markets. When we compare to Australia, we see that there's still a little bit of a deviation there. Also, the one more Western market, of course, that we included, or Western culture, I have to say, that we included in the 4 markets testing in Asia Pacific. But overall, quite encouraging results, at least for 3 of our markets, that were eliminating to some extent the acquiescent response style differences between the different cultures. Now, secondly, let's have a look at socially desirable responses. Now, before we can go into this in more detail, let me kind of explain what we've done here first, because to understand whether a research approach is impacted by social desirability, first we needed to understand whether any of the messages and the benefits that we communicated about would be socially desirable or not. So all of the 10 items that we tested, we first got a measure for on social desirability. What you see here is for the top 3 most socially desirable items, how well they performed in the 3 different methods when it came to appeal. So in the top you see when using the rating question to ask for individual people's preferences, the score actually corresponds very much to that of social desirability. So for me as an individual, if I answer a rating question, my preferences would be more likely to correspond to social desirability. Whereas in the swiping exercise, my preferences are less likely to correspond to social desirability. So if my preferences differ somewhat from what would be considered socially desirable, those preferences are more likely to come out in the swiping exercise than in the rating exercise. Now, if we flip that around to the other side, when we look at the least socially desirable items, we see the same trend happening. When we look at the rating scores, on average, the appeal with using the rating score is much lower for the least socially desirable items. Whereas for me as an individual, maybe my preferences differ from what is socially desirable, and if I use a swiping exercise, I'm more likely to find that I rank the items higher compared to what's socially desirable. So wrapping up, we talked just now about three main challenges of doing research in emerging markets. The first, for it to be difficult to find the target groups that you want to reach, or especially doing so in a cost-effective way. We see that doing mobile research, especially in markets like Asia and other emerging markets, can help us expand our reach. The second challenge we talked about was for traditional survey methods to be rather complex and sometimes difficult to understand for target groups, especially in emerging markets. Now, simple and intuitive research techniques, such as the one we presented about today, can help raise engagement. They're also more entertaining. They can help increase our data quality. The third trend we talked about was the challenge of cultural norms sometimes making it difficult to understand what real and underlying preferences are for respondents. And again, using approaches that are intuitive and also that rely more on the subconscious in making choices can help us reduce these biases, at least to some extent. And we focused our talk today mainly on emerging markets, but many of these trends, of course, are relevant as well in established and developed markets where there is pressure to decrease complexity of approaches. There's pressure to get closer to the subconscious, to the real way that people make decisions, and step away from some more traditional research approaches as well.